Hello. On behalf of the Historical Society of Harford County, welcome to this virtual event in 3 parts: Divided Union, Harford County in the Civil War. The Historical Society of Harford County Incorporated, established at the county courthouse in 1885, is the oldest county historical society in Maryland. The Historical Society collects, preserves, promotes, and interprets the rich and diverse history of the Harford County area in its regional context from prehistoric origins to the present for the education and enjoyment of current and future generations. The Society's headquarters at 145 North Main Street in Bel Air, Maryland, houses extensive collections of court records, artifacts, photos, books, newspapers, portraits, articles, and written materials by and about the people and places of Harford County. The Society also operates the 1788 Hayes House Museum in the oldest home within the Bel Air, Maryland town limits. The Hayes House is a living history museum and a valuable educational resource that illustrates and recreates the social and cultural aspects of the daily life of the rural gentry in the formative years of our country. Unfortunately, both the Hayes House and the headquarters building are closed to the public, at least through the end of 2020, to help halt the spread of the COVID-19 pandemic. In the meantime, you can become a member, request research, and browse a portion of our collection on the Society's website, www.harfordhistory.org. This presentation is the second of 2 presentations chronicling the role of Harford County and her people during the Civil War. This episode focuses on the years 1863 to 1865. You also have the opportunity to join the presenter in a virtual live question and answer session on October 13th, 2020. More on that later. The presenter is Jeffrey K. Smart, a longtime member of the Historical Society and retired U.S. Army historian who specializes in military history. He holds both bachelor's and master's degrees in history from San Jose State University in San Jose, California. He served as the editor of the Harford Historical Bulletin from 1993 to 2003 and has written 8 bulletin articles. He resides with his wife Paige in Bel Air, Maryland. Now let us begin.
This is part 2 of Harford County in the Civil War, 1861 to 1865, a divided union. Part 2 will cover 1863 to the end of the war in 1865. First, though, I want to do a little bit review about what was covered in part 1. As you can see on this chart here, this is the strategic importance of Harford County because it had several key bridges on the railroads that ran north and south, and also because of its strategic location within Maryland and within the United States. During 1861, the Bush River Bridge and the Gunpowder River Bridge were both burned. At least a portion of them were burned and blocked troop transports from the north coming into Baltimore. From then on, in 1861, Union troops from the north were sent into Harford County, and they not only protected those 2 bridges, but they also protected the ferryboat Maryland that moved the train cars from Perryville across the Susquehanna River to Havre de Grace, since there was no bridge across the river there at that time. And also of importance was the Conowingo Bridge, which was a pedestrian, horse, wagon, and even herd of cows were used on that bridge. So that's where Maryland and Harford County was in 1863. Now, 1863 is going to be an important year in the history of the Civil War in Harford County. Up until this time, there had been no battles or skirmishes or anything in Harford County. And starting in 1863, it becomes much more of an issue, particularly during the Gettysburg Campaign. Now, the Gettysburg Campaign involved the Confederate Army coming up from Virginia and entering Pennsylvania and coming around towards Harrisburg. And this campaign would be have a terrible impact on Harford County with its participants. Particularly of note is the Harford Countyans in the Gettysburg Campaign in the Union Army. As previously mentioned in Part 1, Edwin Webster, who was the colonel of the 7th Maryland Infantry Regiment, was from Harford County, Bel Air, and commanded the unit. He was also the U.S. Congressman for Harford County. And two of his companies, each one about 100 soldiers, were Company C and Company H. Now, there was other leaders from Harford County. Colonel Robert Rogers commanded the 2nd Maryland Eastern Shore Regiment, and similar to the 7th Maryland, two of his companies, Company G and Company H, were primarily enlisted within Harford County. Also, there was William Molesby, who commanded a 1st Regiment Potomac Home Brigade. And then there was Captain Robert Duvall, who I had mentioned in the previous Part 1, commanding Company A, Purnell's Maryland Cavalry. So these are just some of the examples of the people from Harford County who play roles in the Gettysburg Campaign. Likewise, there were several Harford Countyans in the Confederate Army during the Gettysburg Campaign. Particularly of greatest interest is James J. Archer, who as a brigadier general will be with the Confederate Army and is the senior officer on either side of Union or Confederate that came from Harford County. Also, I'd mentioned William R. Bazelle. He is a captain in Pickett's division of the Army that's already in Pennsylvania. A couple other ones were Frank Bond. He's a captain in the Maryland Cavalry unit. And also, an example, Private James D. Waters, 1st Maryland Cavalry. And interesting enough, he later becomes a judge in Harford County after the war. Now, as mentioned in the Part 1, I tried to follow a little bit along with one of the civilians in Harford County, Mrs. Priscilla Stump Griffith. And she was married to a slave owner, lived just south of Aberdeen, and she wrote a very interesting diary of her experiences. And it should be noted that by June 16th, 1863, she had already heard rumors that the rebels are coming into our neighborhood and that people were beginning to panic, money taken from Port Deposit Bank in expectation of their arrival, and federal soldiers coming to Havre de Grace to protect it, gunboats also to defend the ferry boat. To protect the other bridges in Harford County, the Bush River and the Gunpowder River, Secretary of Navy Gideon Wells ordered the Navy to send 2 of your smallest boats into the Gunpowder River and 1 into the Bush River to communicate with the military authorities there and assist in guarding those bridges. So already in the Gettysburg Campaign, the senior leadership in Washington is looking at Harford County, and particularly those 2 railroad bridges. There were many warnings about what the Confederates could do, and also there was warnings about what Southern sympathizers in Harford County might do. For example, orders sent to the commanding officer of the Union forces in Havre de Grace stated, "Have your men watchful all along the line. a small cavalry force of rebels or a little squad of copperheads may attempt mischief, and you must be prepared to make them suffer if they do. Copperheads were people in the North who opposed the war and favored the Southern cause. There was concern for the Conowingo Bridge. Confederates had already occupied York and threatened Harrisburg. So Union troops were told to go down to protect the Conowingo Bridge. The orders were, have reliable men sent down to the Conowingo Bridge, impress horses, and send good officers or volunteers. The commanding officer will take up planks, and in no event should that bridge fall into enemy hands. As part of the Union preparations for Confederates possibly coming into the area, Union cavalry was sent into Bel Air on June 28, 1863. 88 soldiers of the 1st Delaware Cavalry Regiment, under the command of Captain William L. Cannon, who happened to be the son of the governor of Delaware, arrived in Bel Air and camped in the field of Dr. Elijah Bond, which you can see on the map there on the right. That is approximately across 924 from where Bel Air United Methodist Church is. Their mission was to search for Confederate raiders, arrest Southern sympathizers, suspicious characters, and anyone who might support the Confederates. They arrested two people, interestingly enough. One was John S. Dallam, the former sheriff of Harford County and currently a hotel keeper. You can see on the map of Bel Air on the right there that there was Dallam's Harford House. And also, interestingly enough, Robert W. Newman, the principal of the Harford Academy in Bel Air. Doesn't really state why those two were arrested, but the soldiers locked them in the Bel Air jail, and then they were sent to Baltimore and not released until July 17th, long after the Battle of Gettysburg, after taking the oath of allegiance. On July 1st, 1863, the Union and Confederate armies collided at the Battle of Gettysburg, north of Harford County. The first day, there was a Confederate attack on Union forces that did not go well. General Archer was captured and sent to the rear of the Union lines. There he met Union Major General Abner Doubleday, an old friend. Doubleday said, "Good morning, Archer. How are you? I'm glad to see you." Archer replied, "Well, I'm not glad to see you by a damn sight." Archer was the first general officer captured since General Lee took command of the Confederate Army of Northern Virginia. The Union cavalry in Bel Air was sent to Havre de Grace also on that same day, July 1st. And Cannon, the commander of the unit, received new orders. He said, he was told, "You will, on receipt of this, instead of pursuing your march as heretofore ordered by telegraph, march by the best route to Havre de Grace on the Philadelphia, Wilmington, and Baltimore Railroad. On your way, you will continue to collect the horses of disloyal citizens, as heretofore ordered, giving receipts for them with proper description. You will also, on your way to Havre de Grace, arrest and carry with you all suspicious persons or known active or mischievous secessionists or rebel sympathizers in that part of the country." Of course, it doesn't explain to Captain Cannon exactly how he was to determine who was a disloyal citizen, nor who was a mischievous secessionist, but that was his orders. On July 2nd, the Navy gunboats that the Secretary of Navy had ordered arrived at the Gunpowder Bridge. They sent the USS Curley to guard that bridge. The orders were to place the Curley in the best position for guarding the bridge, cooperate with the military authorities without assuming any control over them. You can advise with the commanding officer and act according to your discretion, keeping in view the object you were sent to accomplish, the protection of the bridge. The commander of the Curley reported that he arrived at the Gunpowder Bridge, and that there were 200 infantry already there protecting the bridge. But July 3rd, the last major fighting at the Battle of Gettysburg occurred, properly known as the Pickett's Charge. Captain William Bazelle, as a member of Pickett's division, fell wounded during the charge, hit by 2 bullets in the left shoulder that broke several bones, and from an exploding artillery shell that injured his leg and stunned him, knocking him to the ground. He collapsed on the battlefield and remained there unattended for 48 hours until finally taken to a Union field hospital. That is understandable considering the total number of casualties of both Union and Confederate during the 3-day battle at Gettysburg was over 5,600 killed and over 27,000 wounded. So there were dead and wounded all over the battlefield. Meanwhile, Mrs. Griffith, back in Harford County, was hearing rumors and seeing what was going on around them. She wrote, "It was imprudent for women to ride alone in these unsettled times. And as far as we can hear, the Confederates have a dearly bought advantage. Great slaughter on both sides. General Archer taken prisoner. Also, probably Captain Cannon's Union cavalry visit Oakington, which belonged to her brother Herman Stump. Soldiers were at the stables to take away all the horses. They only took one of Herman's carriage horses. Herman escaped despite soldiers' inquiry about him." Bel-Air had some problems following the Battle of Gettysburg. The Aegis report that a large train of Army wagons, together with a number of horses, passed through the town on their way, as we are informed, from Harrisburg to Baltimore. They halted for a short time in the place, and during their stay, some persons attached to the train entered the barroom of John S. Dallam and destroyed and carried off everything of value which it contained. Against these proceedings, we learn that some of the better disposed persons belonging to the train strongly protested. By July 11th, 1863, almost a week after the battle, Harford County was still concerned about the many wounded, both of the Union and Confederates, particularly those who had members in the Confederate Army that lost the battle. And the Aegis reported that between $200 and $300 was collected in Bel-Air and Churchville and in the vicinity of those places for the sufferers in the late battles near Gettysburg. Now, as stated, Captain Bazelle was seriously wounded at the Battle of Gettysburg on the 3rd day. And Mrs. Bazelle, this is a photograph of her much later, received a letter from her husband stating that he was wounded in the shoulder, not very dangerously, that he was lying in hospital camp near Gettysburg. She immediately consulted with her friends and made arrangements to go to him. She said, "I collected together such medicine as I thought necessary." Within a few days, she and doctors from Bel-Air headed for Gettysburg. The doctors, Dr. Richardson, Lee, and Richardson, left for Gettysburg, and as the Aegis article said, to render whatever surgical or medical aid that might be in their power. The promptness which these gentlemen have repaired to the place of suffering is highly creditable to them. Each of the physicians are men of considerable experience, and we have no doubt that their visit will be found to be one of usefulness. Now, Mrs. Bazelle and her daughter Lizzie arrived in Baltimore, and she stated, "We obtained the necessary passes and were admitted as members of the Christian Association, whose peculiar business it is to care for the wounded." The reason she did this is because the Union Army had issued warnings that any Confederate prisoner, any wounded person, could not be helped by local relatives. They had to remain in the prisoner hospitals. And this meant that Mrs. Bazelle could not just say, well, my husband was wounded in the Confederate Army, can I go help him? So she had to kind of be sly about it and say she was a member of the Christian Association. She went with her daughter, Lizzie, and then one of the doctors from Harford County, Hall Richardson, and after an exhaustive search of the Gettysburg area, found Captain Bazelle. Interestingly enough, we found him lying in a fly tent upon the ground with nothing under him but his blanket and a small pillow under his head. And that picture kind of shows probably a little bit what a Union hospital would look like. She said, I was afraid to do anything, as I was told that I would be arrested and sent back to Baltimore if I manifested any feelings. And that's because of those Union laws. She said, we have to be thankful for many kindnesses during our stay in Gettysburg, as we received every attention that was possible for men to bestow. There was no difference shown on account of Mr. Bazelle's politics, and he was kept in the Union camp and not sent off to the rebels. Despite their treatment, though, and the amputation of his arm, Captain Bazelle died at the hospital camp in the presence of his wife and daughter. He was initially buried in a Presbyterian cemetery in Gettysburg, and then eventually reburied in Churchville Presbyterian Church Cemetery. His tombstone reads, in memory of our beloved father, William R. Bazelle, who fell at the Battle of Gettysburg on the 3rd of July and died of his wounds on the 17th of July, 1863, in the 53rd year of his age. There was also a Bible verse on his tomb said, I have fought a good fight, I have finished my course, I have kept the faith. Now, Bel Air and Harford County continued to be impacted by the Battle of Gettysburg long after the Confederate Army had retreated back to Virginia. For example, on July 17th, the Aegis reported, for the last week or 10 days, large droves of fat cattle have been passing almost daily through our town on the way to Baltimore. These cattle are principally from the state of Ohio and come by the way of Philadelphia and Harrisburg and cross the Susquehanna River at Conowingo. Their passage through this section, we are informed, is caused by the interruption of the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad and the danger of driving them by the way of Frederick, as was formerly the custom. So in this picture of downtown Bel Air, basically, if you can imagine a large herd of cattle being driven right through Main Street. There was continued efforts to help with the many wounded and sick from the Battle of Gettysburg. On July 30th, 1863, the Aegis reported, the ladies of the Union Relief Association of Baltimore and Harford counties will give a concert of vocal and instrumental music at the courthouse in Bel Air on Thursday, July 30th. The proceeds to be applied for the benefit of the wounded soldiers. Supper and refreshments will be provided. Now, after the events of the Gettysburg Campaign had died down, there was a draft in Harford County. July of 1863 began the process of completing the draft. It was called the Enrollment Act, also called the Draft Act. It had been signed back in March 3rd. And in that act, it said that all males ages 20 through 45 must enroll, or in other words, make themselves known as eligible for the draft, unless exempt. And there were several types of exemptions. One, you could provide or pay for a substitute. The value of the substitute depending on whatever the substitute wanted to charge and how much you wanted to pay. Or you could simply pay $300 and get out of the draft. Some of the comments about the draft instructions is drafted men become soldiers in the service of the United States by the fact of their names having been drawn in the draft. The notification served upon them by the Provost Marshal is merely an announcement of the fact and an order for them to report for duty at the designated time and place. Any person failing to report for duty after notice is left at his last place or served on him personally without furnishing a substitute or paying $300 is pronounced by law to be a deserter. He may be arrested and held for that by court-martial and sentenced to death. So it was taken very seriously by the Union forces in Harford County and also in Maryland to enforce this draft act. There was opposition to the draft in Harford County. For example, on July 25th, 1863, the Baltimore Sun reported an article titled "The Draft and Incendiarism," stated, "Several incendiary fires have within a few days past occurred in Harford and Dorchester counties, Maryland. These fires, it is alleged, were caused by persons who are opposed to the draft. In the neighborhood of Jarrettsville, Harford County, the barns of Levi Pennington, the father of the enrolling officer, with 500 bushels of corn and provender, and the barn of Mr. Joseph Perry, with its contents and one horse, were destroyed by fire. When the former barn was discovered on fire, 5 men were seen running hastily from it. While the barn of Mr. Pennington was burning, a noise was made on the outside of his dwelling, inducing his cousin, who was the only male in the house, to throw open the window, on which 6 pistol shots were fired at him. He narrowly escaped injury." The official Union response to these barn burnings stated, "2 barns and other property situated in the 4th election district, Harford County, Maryland, belonging to or occupied by Levi Pennington and Joseph Perry and brother, loyal citizens of that district, having been burnt and destroyed by persons who resorted to that outrage as a means of preventing and deterring the proper official authorities from the enforcement of the Enrollment Act and draft of militia in that county. Therefore, that the full value of said properties shall be paid for by the disloyal citizens of that neighborhood. For this purpose, an assessment of $3,000, being the estimated value of the property destroyed, is made and shall be collected immediately in the following amounts and from the following named persons known to be disaffected to the loyal government of the country, and encouragers of rebellion and treason, and who reside within a distance of 6 miles from the points where the barns were burnt." In other words, they were just going to try to identify disloyal citizens of the neighborhood. They came up with 35 names, and then they were given a certain amount of the $3,000 that they would have to pay. For example, Dr. St. Clair Street and Dr. Abraham Street received the highest fines. Others had sons in the Confederate Army. Collecting the fines was assigned to Captain Cannon, again, the Union cavalry commander in Bel Air. Interesting story in the Baltimore Sun. It's called "A Lively Time in Bel Air, Maryland." When Captain Cannon collected the fines, that part was pretty simple, and they collected the right amount of money. But the interesting part was the above incidents caused a number of persons to assemble in Bel Air, which occasion was taken advantage of by a cavalry company stationed there, and several fine horses were pressed into the service for the use of the said cavalry company. Those from whom horses were taken were presented with a receipt for the same, and if they can prove their loyalty, will be paid for the same at some future time. Now, also unique to 1863, the first regiment of African American troops began to get organized in Maryland, the 4th U.S. Colored Troops, as it was called. And African Americans in Harford County began to enlist in that. For example, we had 3 brothers, Alfred Hilton, Henry Hilton, and Aaron Hilton. all of which went down to Baltimore and enlisted. One was made a sergeant, Alfred, one was made a corporal, Henry, and one was made a private, Aaron. Not until October 1863 was there any reports of anyone actually being arrested and charged with a crime of barn burnings in Harford County. On October 24th, the Baltimore Sun ran an article about an alleged fugitive. On Thursday, which would have been October 22nd, James T. Whittaker was arrested in this city on the charge of having escaped from the jail in Bel Air, where he was confined on the charge of having set fire to the barn of an enrolling officer in Harford County. He was yesterday committed subject to the order of the Sheriff of Harford. Now this, unfortunately, is the only reference I have been able to find on James Whittaker. I do not know if he ever went to trial or was ever found guilty of any crime, nor was anyone else ever identified as being guilty of burning the barns in Harford County. The draft itself occurred on December 3rd through 4th, 1863. It was held at the Provost Marshal's office, which is basically the military police. Generally what they did was they would put what was called a wheel. They would put the names into that and then draw from that the person being blindfolded. So this is an example of probably what was happened. They printed all the names of everyone who was drafted. Interesting enough, for example, Alfred W. Bateman is listed right there. He is the publisher of the Aegis at the time. You can see his name on the Aegis headlines. And there's his picture, too, hanging in the courthouse. He later became a judge. He ended up using one of the exemptions of being too old and got out of the draft. 1864 follows all the activity in 1863 connected with the Gettysburg Campaign. The war has pretty much moved south of the Maryland-Virginia border, at least for a moment. One of the big events going on in 1864 was Maryland decided to look at whether the state needed a new constitution. So in February 1864, Maryland legislature approved a bill calling for a state convention to change the state constitution to abolish slavery. This was, of course, a very controversial topic because slavery was legal in Maryland. April 6, 1864, a referendum approved holding a state constitutional convention. Then, between April and September 1864, the Constitutional Convention met in Annapolis and developed a final version of the Constitution abolishing slavery in Maryland. The referendum to approve or disapprove the new Constitution was scheduled for October. In the meantime, another draft, and there were several drafts throughout 1863, 1864, was held, and this time there was a smaller number. You can see on the Aegis article, again, they listed all the different names. And the most interesting thing about this particular list of names is that you will notice throughout there, some of them are slaves. For example, Charles Morgan in the middle is a slave, and there's others who are identified as slaves. The other aspect of the exemptions is they published a list of the types of exemptions that were used for the draft in Harford County. For example, 12 were over age, 3 underage, 3 non-U.S. citizens, 44 physically disabled, 41 furnished substitutes, 83 paid commutation over the $300, 2 already were in the military, 5 wrongfully enrolled for some reason, and 4 had already died. While the Constitution referendum was still being considered, and the draft was still going on. The Confederates decided to move an army up into Maryland. They won the Battle of Monocacy Junction and moved east, kind of threatening Baltimore, but eventually they will turn south towards Washington, D.C. But in the meantime, they sent cavalry forces into Maryland towards Baltimore, and particularly assigned a small unit under Major Harry Gilmore, only about 135 men, some of which were from Harford County, and they were all Marylanders. You can see on the chronology here, Harry Gilmore, who was from the Baltimore area, stopped at Cockeysville, visited his family on July 10th, then camped along Mountain Road that evening at the old stagecoach building. You can see a picture of it there with a historical marker on Mountain Road 152, just next to it. And then he headed on July 11th to Magnolia Station on the Philadelphia-Wilmington-Baltimore Railroad. There, his objective was to burn and destroy the Gunpowder Bridge. The bridge, though, was guarded by 32 Union soldiers on the south side, and on the north side, it was guarded by soldiers who had just been raised, which means they were only 30 days soldiers, and they just arrived the night before from Delaware. And also there was a gunboat in the Gunpowder River called the USS Juniata. On July 11th, Harry Gilmore left his campground on Mountain Road and went to Magnolia train station. There, he captured 2 trains. First one he ended up burning. The second one he ended up capturing and allowing the passengers to remove their personal property. On one of the trains, he also found a Union Major General, Franklin, who he captured. Then he set the train on fire and sent it out onto the bridge. This caused the Union troops on his side of the bridge to retreat across the bridge to the other side, and that allowed the train to stop right in the middle of the Gunpowder Bridge and burn through and fall into the gunpowder. The gunboat Juniata, which was supposed to help protect the bridge, was not prepared and was only able to send some help to the soldiers who had jumped off the bridge into the water. Harry Gilmore was able to take his troops back safely to the Confederate Army that was around Washington, D.C., contemplating whether to attack it or not. They decided not to, and they retreated back into Virginia, leaving Harford County with little damage other than a bridge that could be repaired within a few days. Even General Franklin, the next night, was able to escape from Harry Gilmore's troops. Now, their impact on the local Harford counties was kind of interesting because Mrs. Griffith wrote in her diary, "Fear the freight will be stopped before our stove arrives. Don't know what we will do, for ours will not bake at all." So these actions had an impact on the local people. But she also reported on what had happened that she understood. She said, "Great excitement amongst the citizens. 3 gunboats in the river, 8 or 10 cannon at one corner, squads of soldiers all about, sentinels along the roads at railroad crossings, rebels only 6 miles off. They have destroyed the bridge at Gunpowder, burnt the trains of cars, captured officers on board." In July, apparently, Harford County suffered from what was called fake news. Related to the Gunpowder Bridge skirmish, there was an article in the Philadelphia Inquirer of the 13th that an enormous battle had taken place in Bel Air. And the Aegis had fun with this, saying that the great cavalry fight in Bel Air, reported by the Philadelphia Inquirer of the 13th, a paper remarkable for sensation reports, did not take place. A Confederate or two occasionally rode into town, but they interfered with no one, nor were they themselves interfered with. Our neighbors of the city press are a good deal given to sensation reports, and we are not surprised, just at this time when printing paper is 18 cents a pound, that our neighbors of the Inquirer should even get up an expedient to sell their paper at the expense of our quiet village. But fighting was still going on in Virginia, and at the Battle of Chaffin's Farm on September 29, 1864, the Union troops from Harford County lost one of their most important people, Sergeant Alfred B. Bhilton. He died of his wounds on October 21st, 1864. And in April 6, 1865, he received the Medal of Honor for Chaffin's Farm. The citation for that stated, "When the regimental color bearer fell, the soldiers seized the color and carried it forward, together with the national standard, until disabled at the enemy's inner line." He is the only Medal of Honor winner from Harford County. He's buried in Hampton National Cemetery in Virginia. The Confederates also lost a Harford Countyan, General Archer. General Archer had been captured July 1st at the Battle of Gettysburg, and not until the summer of 1864 was he released and sent back down to Virginia. And in August 1864, he returned to active duty. However, all of his term in the Union prison broke his health, and he very quickly had to leave active duty. October 24th, 1864, he died in Richmond, Virginia, and is buried there in Hollywood Cemetery. The referendum for the new state constitution that would abolish slavery was held October 12th through the 13th. The referendum ended up approving the new Constitution, but how it was approved was a bit controversial. Harford County and the majority of Maryland citizens voted against it. Only 27,000 for and 29,000 against. However, a special case was set up where Union soldiers in the field could vote in the election. And over 2,637 soldiers voted. That changed the results. The for now went to 30,000, and the against only 29,000. It was approved by 375 votes. On October 29th, the proclamation issued by Governor Bradford announced the Constitution was approved. On November 1st, 1864, the new state constitution went into effect and slavery ended in Maryland. Now for Mrs. Griffith, she said, the governor's proclamation issued putting the new constitution in effect November 1st. Slaves all free. Mr. Griffith gave them the information at dinner time today. Later she wrote, best for us to go and see about hiring a servant or two. Ours are all going to leave, all free today. Don't know what we are to do when they all go. In addition to the draft, the Constitution, Harry Gilmore's raid, there was also a presidential election in November 8th, 1864. President Lincoln won the presidential election in Maryland. In Harford County, though, Lincoln lost by 361 votes. Keep in mind that there's two newspapers in Bel Air. One, the National American, is pro-Union, and one, the Aegis, is pro-Southern. And you can see by who they were recommending to vote for. The National American favored Abraham Lincoln, and the Aegis favored George B. McClellan. 1864 had been a very, very busy year, and Harford County had many impacts on their citizens and on the bridges, for example. 1865 is going to be another year that will have major impacts. Two of the last Harford County soldiers killed in the Civil War may have been these two, Albert Gilbert and George Jones. They were killed just before the Appomattox campaign down in Virginia. They were members of the 7th Maryland. And, for example, Albert Gilbert got his obituary in the National American. He was age 27, and they wrote a really nice article about him. His mother was Sophia Gilbert, a widow, and he is buried down in Poplar Grove National Cemetery in Virginia. George Jones, who was about 18, also died at the same day in an action called White Oaks Roads. April 9th was the surrender of Robert E. Lee's army in Virginia at Appomattox Courthouse to General Ulysses S. Grant. Baltimore Sun had big headlines, glorious news, surrender of General Lee, General Grant's terms complied with. Neither of the other two newspapers seem to have had any significant headlines, although some of the National American newspapers about that time are not available. Mrs. Griffith simply wrote in her diary, "Fear the South will have to yield to numbers. They have held out bravely and nobly and deserve better than admittance into the Union with the Yankees, but this may be the end." There was one more event during the Civil War that impacted Harford County. That was the activity of John Wilkes Booth and his plot to assassinate the president. John Wilkes was born near Bel Air in Tudor Hall. He attended Harford Academy. He was a famous actor, a Southern sympathizer. He initially had contemplated kidnapping the president. He gathered a group of supporters with him, and after the capture of Lee's army, he decided instead of capturing President Lincoln, he would assassinate him. Booth shot President Lincoln at Ford's Theater on April 14th, 1865. It was a national disaster. Even Mrs. Griffith in her diary note, "It is a horrible affair and will doubtless lead to more trouble for the nation." The National American article on it said basically that the town of Bel Air was in celebration for the capture of Lee's army in the near end of the war, and then suddenly the news comes across the telegraph that the president has been shot. And it noted, "Our beloved president was shot by John Wilkes Booth, a man well known to many of our citizens, and during his boyhood, a resident of this county." In Bel Air, April 19th, 1865, there was a religious gathering. It was kind of a funeral for President Lincoln. Many of the churches in Bel Air got together and had a ceremony with speeches, and everything was draped in mourning, and the stars and stripes in deep mourning hung in solemn folds over the entrance. Mrs. Griffith even commented, "Everybody grieving for Lincoln, now he is dead, all find out how truly good he was, and how much to be lamented. It is the worst thing that could have happened at this time." Booth was captured and mortally wounded on April 26, 1865, down in Virginia. He did have his last words, which were, "Tell mother I died for my country," before he died. And all the other conspirators were captured that they knew of, and eventually many of those were hung. The end of the fighting, though, did not mean all problems were solved. For example, in Harford County, there was concern among the loyal men of Havre de Grace what would happen when these former Confederate soldiers returned to their city. They created a committee to address that issue. And their concerns were that certain parties left Havre de Grace in the early stages of the rebellion and united their fortunes with the miscreant Jeff Davis and the host of atrocious villains that have followed in his footsteps, that have involved the country in a debt of thousands of millions of dollars, clad the nation in mourning, sacrilegiously polluted our soil with the dead bodies of thousands of its guiltless sons, and have finally capped the climax of their unspeakable infamy by the assassination of our noble and kind-hearted president. And that therefore, none of the parties who left Havre de Grace for the purposes mentioned above shall ever be permitted to reside within its limits, whether paroled or not. There was other similar articles to this one that other towns, including Bel Air, were very concerned about the relationship would be between former Confederates and those who supported the Union. To somewhat help out those kind of situation, President Andrew Johnson, President Lincoln's successor, issued a proclamation of amnesty on May 29th, 1865. In there he said, "I, Andrew Johnson, President of the United States, do proclaim and declare that I have hereby grant to all persons who have directly or indirectly participated in the existing rebellion amnesty and pardon, but with a few exceptions. Some of those exceptions included if they were former U.S. military officers. Some included those who had attended West Point. Some included every Confederate officer above a colonel, for example, a general. There were very specific exemptions to that, but the intent was to get the Confederate soldiers back home again and to restore peace. So by the mid part of 1865, the end of the war pretty much came to a conclusion with the surrender of the Confederacy, capture of President Davis, and as an event to honor the death of President Lincoln, there was a national day of fasting on the June 1st. That the day appointed by the president. The stores, hotels, and public offices were closed and businesses generally suspended. As the Aegis reported, we believe that only one of our churches was open. This was, however, unavoidable as all the other ministers had engagements at other churches out of town for that day. So there was still celebration for the conclusion of war by far. But the war did not officially end until August 20th, 1866, when President Andrew Johnson issued this proclamation, "I do further proclaim that the said insurrection is at an end and that peace, order, tranquility, and civil authority now exist in and throughout the whole of the United States." Of course, again, the idea of peace, order, and tranquility maybe a little bit early for what went on in the South and even in Maryland, when you have two sides coming back together again, and it would take a long time for the Union and Confederate sides to join back together. The monument there at the Battle of Gettysburg, the Maryland monument, had the interesting line about brothers again, Marylanders all. It would take a long time for Harford County to become brothers again because brothers served on different sides of the war, and it would be remembered particularly so many of those families in Harford County had empty seats at their dinner tables of soldiers who died either from combat wounds or in prisons or in by disease, which was, again, the major killer of most of the troops on both sides. But that ends the war and completes my presentation.
We hope you have enjoyed this presentation on Harford County's role in the Civil War from 1863 to 1865. If you have not already done so, please watch Part 1, looking at the years 1860 to 1862. That presentation is available at www.harfordhistory.org. For more information on Harford County and the Civil War, read the Harford Historical Bulletin articles authored by Jeff Smart, including a 3-part series on the Civil War in Harford County during 1861, a 2-part series on Harford County in the Civil War in 1862, and Part 1 of Harford County in the Civil War in 1863. Jeff has also written A History of Edgewood Arsenal in World War I. You can purchase copies of these and other Harford Historical Bulletins through the Society's bookstore on our website. Please join us on October 13th for a live webinar conversation with Jeff Smart about Harford County and the Civil War. You will have the chance to ask your questions and hear Jeff answer them live. Feel free to submit your questions in advance at virtual@harfordhistory.org. You may register for the October 13th question and answer session through www.harfordhistory.org. Thank you, and please join us again.